It was precisely 3 minutes past midnight when the great bell of St. Luke's Church tolled once. Just once. Not the gentle chime of a misfiring clock tower, nor the slow ring of a sleepy sexton. This was deliberate, loud, and singular, like a punctuation mark thrust into the dead quiet of a sleeping village. It echoed across the rooftops of Milchester, jarring those light sleepers in cottages near the churchyard, and causing the vicar's dog to whimper uneasily. But it was the gardener, Thomas Clay, trudging home along the cemetery lane after a late pint at the pub, who noticed something else. A figure, cloaked and hurried, slipping through the Ironside gate near the vestry, vanishing into the shadows, behind the chapel. The next morning, the church was buzzing, not with hymns, but with gasps. The sexton, Mr. Gilbert Binns, had arrived early to polish the brass candlesticks and found the vestry door slightly ajar. That in itself was odd. The vestry door was always bolted after evening prayers, but what truly halted him was the figure slumped on the floor just beyond it. The Reverend Lionel Greaves lay motionless on the Persian rug, his spectacles askew and a dark bruise rising on his temple. No blood, no broken furniture, no signs of a struggle. Just a vicar, dead in his own church, and no apparent explanation as to how or why. The police arrived promptly, summoned by Mrs. Copley, the housekeeper, who had followed Mr. Binns' panicked instructions. Inspector George Craddock of the Milchester Constabulary, a broad-shouldered man with an irritable moustache and a fondness for clarity, examined the scene with growing irritation. No sign of forced entry, no weapon in sight. The church doors were locked, and only the vestry key, kept on a hook in the vicarage, was missing. The bell rope was still tied up in its usual coil. Nobody admitted to having rung the bell. Dr. Penrose, the town physician, was summoned. His preliminary assessment suggested that the Reverend had died sometime shortly after midnight, likely from a blow to the head, delivered by a blunt object. But what object and why? Nothing had been stolen. Not the silver communion plate, not the donation box, not even the vicar's watch. The only unusual item in the room was a small scrap of paper tucked beneath the vicar's hand, a torn corner of a page from a hymnal with a single word written in pencil: "Forgive." "Suicide?" someone whispered. But the bruise, the locked room, the mystery of the bell, it didn't add up. News travelled swiftly in Milchester. By 10 o'clock that morning, the mystery had reached the ears of Miss Jane Marple, who happened to be visiting her nephew Raymond and his wife in the village. She'd always preferred countryside mysteries to those in London. Less noise, more clarity. She strolled down to the churchyard that very afternoon, arriving quietly just as Inspector Craddock was concluding his questioning of the church staff. She watched the proceedings from behind a low hedge, observing with a stillness that made even the sparrows on the path hop past her without alarm. Craddock noticed her eventually, and though he wasn't entirely pleased to see Miss Marple, he tipped his hat out of habit. "Afternoon, Miss Marple. You've heard, I suppose?" "I have," she said gently, stepping into view. "Midnight bells tend to wake more than just the town, Inspector." "Yes, well, I suppose you're curious." "More troubled than—" "Curious," she replied. "It is not in St. Luke's character to ring without cause. And the Reverend Greaves—" She paused, looking toward the stone building. "He was not a man given to melodrama." "Quite right," muttered Craddock. "And yet here we are. Locked church, dead vicar, a ringing bell no one claims to have rung. It's like something out of a penny novel." "And the note?" he hesitated. "One word. Forgive." "Odd business." Miss Marple tilted her head. "It's more than odd. It's placed, isn't it? Placed as a message intended to be found. Not something dropped in panic." Craddock nodded, almost reluctantly. "And yet there's nothing else. No signs of a break-in. Nobody reported seeing anyone, except one man too deep in his cups to be believed." claims he saw a shadow near the vestry gate. Was the bell rope disturbed? Not a thread out of place. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Then the bell wasn't rung from below. You're saying someone went up the tower? I'm saying someone wanted it to seem like someone went up the tower, she corrected. But perhaps there are other ways to ring a bell. Craddock blinked. You think this is a staged scene? I think, she said slowly, that if someone intended to draw attention to that very moment in time, to midnight precisely, they might want the bell to sound, a signal perhaps, or a distraction. Miss Marple spent the rest of the afternoon walking slowly through the church grounds. She noted the freshly dug patch near the old crypt, not for a new grave, but where the rose bushes had recently been moved. She paused near the gate mentioned by the inebriated gardener, tested its iron latch, and found it had been oiled recently, with no squeak at all. Returning inside the church, she examined the vestry with particular care. It was modest, lined, with worn books and coats and a large locked cabinet where the chalices were stored. But it was the corner behind the coat rack that caught her eye. The carpet had been slightly disturbed, as if someone had stood there for a long time, or hidden something beneath. She knelt and lifted the edge of the rug. Nothing. But she smiled all the same. By the following morning, the village was buzzing. Again, not with news of the crime, but with speculation. The police had uncovered no further evidence. The autopsy confirmed what had already been suspected: a clean blow to the temple, no signs of defensive wounds. But it was Miss Marple who, over tea, remarked to her nephew, "It is terribly convenient that the church doors were locked, don't you think? It implies no outsider could have entered." Raymond looked up. "But that would mean that someone inside had access, or someone with keys. The housekeeper? The sexton?" Miss Marple stirred her tea. "Or perhaps the Reverend left the door unlocked himself. Maybe he was expecting someone." Raymond blinked. "Then why would the person kill him?" "That," said Miss Marple, "is what we must next uncover. Because I suspect the bell did not merely signal a moment. It announced the end of a secret that could no longer stay hidden." Miss Marple returned to the church alone just after luncheon the next day, her steps slow, her expression calm, but her mind alert as ever. The police had done their work with dutiful order, photographs, measurements, and endless rounds of questioning. But something had settled uncomfortably in her mind. Not a fact, not even a deduction, a feeling. Something about the entire tableau of the vestry. Death was too arranged, as though the chaos had been composed with deliberate care. She paused at the entrance, her eyes drifting upward toward the bell tower. The idea of a bell ringing by itself in the dead of night was fanciful, and Miss Marple had never been fond of fanciful ideas. But she was also not fond of easy answers. She requested the sexton, Mr. Binns, who was busy straightening prayer books, to escort her up the narrow wooden stairs to the bell chamber. He complied, though with clear reluctance. The old tower made him uneasy. The bell itself was a large, heavy casting, suspended on a frame blackened by age and dust. Miss Marple examined the rope, still neatly coiled as Craddock had said, but also noted a strange gleam on the wooden wheel above it. She pointed with a gloved finger. "Has anyone touched that recently?" Mr. Binns squinted up. "No, ma'am, that wheel hasn't moved since Easter, when we last rang it full peal." Said Miss Marple. "Curious. It seems to have a faint smudge of grease. Could be from the pigeons." Miss Marple gave a small nod, but her eyes remained fixed on the smudge. Then, without announcing her thoughts, she turned and descended. Back at the bottom, she lingered once more in the vestry. The torn hymn page had already been collected, but she remembered the exact word: forgive. That word had an oddly forced ring to it. The Reverend was known to be gentle, yes, but not sentimental. Would a man of such calm reason stage a deathbed message? And if someone else had placed it, What were they trying to suggest? Repentance? Accidental death? A plea? She walked to the chapel door, where Mrs. Copley, the housekeeper, was quietly dusting the baptismal font. Miss Marple engaged her in polite conversation, asking after her health, her cat, and whether the Reverend had seemed himself in recent days. Mrs. Copley folded her hands, leaning slightly on her feather duster. He was quiet lately, but he was always a quiet man. Spent more time in the vestry after tea, writing his sermons or visiting his old files. He'd said something about sorting through parish records before the festival. Miss Marple's eyes lit up subtly. Parish records? What sort of records? Oh, births, marriages, burials, you know. All kept in the locked drawer. Only he and the bishop's clerk had keys. I thought it odd he suddenly wanted to reorganize them. And did he mention why? Mrs. Copley hesitated. He did say he'd found an error, some old registration that didn't line up. I didn't press. He was frowning when he said it. I thought it was some silly clerical thing. Miss Marple smiled kindly. Oh, clerical things are rarely silly when they make a clergyman frown. Later that evening, Miss Marple sat quietly at her writing desk at the vicarage where she was staying, going over the few solid facts. The Reverend was not a man involved in scandal. He had no known enemies. He had seemed disturbed by something in the parish records. He had died shortly after midnight, in a vestry locked from the inside, with a note suggesting forgiveness and a bell rung at the exact moment of death. A message, a ruse, or a summons? The next morning, she attended the temporary police station that had been set up in the village hall. Inspector Craddock, though clearly busy and not overly delighted to see her, allowed her a few moments. I just want to ask, she said gently, has anyone accounted for the whereabouts of Mr. Peter Blaine that night? Craddock frowned. The organist said he was home with a cold. Why? No reason. He always struck me as a sensitive sort, given to feeling things too deeply. Craddock raised an eyebrow. Is that important? Only that people who feel deeply sometimes act rashly, she murmured, especially if they believe someone else has betrayed them. Craddock muttered something about armchair psychologists and waved her off, but Miss Marple had planted her seed. She knew Peter Blaine, a lonely man, dedicated to his music, but with a history of emotional overinvestment. He had once courted the vicar's niece, Miss Hilda Greaves, who had rather suddenly left Milchester last month to work in London. It had seemed innocuous at the time, but Hilda's departure had left behind more silence than could be explained. That afternoon, Miss Marple stopped by Peter's cottage under the pretense of delivering a casserole. The organist looked pale and nervous. His hands, once always tapping, were motionless. So tragic, isn't it? She said softly, settling into a chair. The Reverend gone, and now poor Hilda without her uncle's support. Peter froze. Hilda? Yes. It's been hard on her. She must have written to you. You were friends, weren't you? He hesitated. We haven't spoken in some time. But you still think of her, I imagine, said Miss Marple, watching his eyes carefully. And the Reverend, he was fond of her too. Would do anything to protect her. There was a silence. Peter blinked rapidly, then stood to fetch tea he had not offered. As he turned, Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the waste bin near the hearth. A scrap of torn paper, similar to that hymnal leaf, peeked from beneath old tissues. She made no comment. That evening, as she returned to the church for evensong, Miss Marple stopped by the rear of the vestry. With no one watching, she stepped behind the coat rack and quietly lifted the edge of the carpet again. This time, she pulled more firmly and found what she suspected had been missed in the earlier sweep. A small brass hinge protruding from the wooden floor, half covered by an uneven plank. A storage box, hidden, recently disturbed. She did not pry it open, not yet. But the clues were becoming less blurred. A hidden compartment, a forged note, a tower rung by unusual means, and someone, a man or woman, who feared something in the U, records the Reverend had recently uncovered. That night, Miss Marple wrote a quiet letter to a friend in the bishop's office, requesting information on past burial disputes, particularly those concerning forged certificates or hasty interments. Something had happened long ago in Milchester, something buried in paperwork and now threatening to surface. The Reverend had tried to bring it into the light, but someone else had silenced him. And the bell, perhaps that midnight toll had not been for the Reverend at all. Perhaps it had been for someone still alive. The following morning, the village hall, commandeered by Inspector Craddock as his temporary headquarters, buzzed with quiet tension. Chairs scraped, papers shuffled, and constables came and went in short, sharp intervals. Outside, the wind carried the scent of rain and earth, but inside, something heavier hung in the air. Suspicion had begun to root itself in the hearts of those gathered, even as they tried to maintain their polite facades. Miss Marple arrived just as Craddock began to call in the principal witnesses again, not to seek new facts, but to see how their stories stood when heard twice. The first to be questioned was Mrs. Copley, the Reverend's housekeeper, who appeared, with her shawl tightly wrapped and a gaze that flicked nervously from face to face. She recounted, for the second time, the moment she'd discovered the door ajar and the vicar lifeless on the floor. But this time, under firmer questioning, she added a small detail previously omitted. She'd seen the vestry light still on from her own cottage window around midnight. "I assumed the Reverend had dozed off with his lamp again," she said, voice shaking. "He did that sometimes, you know." Craddock jotted this down. "But you said before that you heard the bell and came running." Yes, that's true." "So which was it?" he pressed. "Did you hear the bell and investigate, or did you come because the light was on?" Mrs. Copley paled. "Well, perhaps it was both. I'm not sure now. Everything that night was strange." Miss Marple observed silently, noting how Mrs. Copley had not looked toward the inspector as she answered, but instead kept glancing at the door, as though someone might enter at any moment and contradict her. Next came Peter Blaine. The young organist's face was composed, but Miss Marple could see the faintest tremor in his left hand as he held his coat. His answers were precise, almost rehearsed. "I was unwell. I stayed home, slept through the night." "And no one can confirm that?" Craddock asked. "No," Peter said. "I live alone." Miss Marple tilted her head. "You didn't hear the bell?" He hesitated. "No, I'm quite a heavy sleeper." "You're also quite sensitive to sound, aren't you?" she asked gently. "I recall you once told me the vestry clock ticking kept you from composing after dark." Peter stiffened. "That was years ago." Craddock frowned, then asked, "And you hadn't spoken with the Reverend recently?" "No, we hadn't really spoken since Hilda left." There it was. The name, spoken like a pebble, dropped into a still pond. Peter glanced down at his hands. Miss Marple gave him a soft smile. "I'm very sorry to hear that. You cared deeply, didn't you?" He said nothing. After Peter left, Craddock shook his head. "He's hiding something." Miss Marple nodded, but her expression remained thoughtful. "Yes, but perhaps not what we expect." The next interview was with Mr. Binns, the sexton. Craddock asked routine questions when he had last locked the doors, whether he had seen anything unusual in the days before. Mr. Binns's answers were clipped and consistent. But Miss Marple asked, "You mentioned you saw a shadow by the gate that night. What made you so certain it wasn't the Reverend himself?" Mr. Binns scratched his neck. "Didn't look like him. The figure was quicker, more hurried. Reverend Greaves never moved like that. He was deliberate." And yet you didn't mention that detail before. I wasn't sure. Thought I might be imagining things. But you weren't, she said. Because the gate had been oiled. That shadow didn't want to be heard. Craddock leaned forward. And who else had access to the oil, Mr. Binns? The sexton blinked. It's kept in the tool shed. Most church staff could get to it, I suppose. Miss Marple pressed no further, but her mind was already drawing lines between that oiled gate, the smudged bell wheel, and the missing hymnal page. Each detail had the feel of orchestration. Someone had gone to great lengths to shape a scene. Down, to the moment the bell rang, last came Miss Hilda Greaves. She had returned to Milchester that very morning upon learning of her uncle's death, and Craddock, wary of missing any thread, had summoned her straight to the hall. She was composed, well-dressed, and answered in a clear voice. But Miss Marple detected a wariness beneath her poise. I left for London last month to take a position in a school, she explained. My uncle supported the move, though he was sad to see me go. Did he say anything before you left that seemed unusual? Craddock asked. Hilda hesitated. Only that I should be careful about what I wrote in letters, that people often misunderstood words. Craddock looked confused. Letters? Yes, she said slowly. I'd written to a friend, someone in the village. It was nothing inappropriate, but I think Uncle Lionel feared it might be taken the wrong way. Who was the letter to? She paused too long. Peter Blaine. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. And did he take it the wrong way? Hilda's voice dropped. I think perhaps he did. I tried to end things gently, but he wouldn't. Let go. He visited the vicarage several times after I left, even when I'd asked him not to. Did your uncle confront him? Miss Marple asked. I believe so, Hilda whispered. The week before his death. Outside, a clock struck noon. The sound rang through the open window of the hall, crisp and certain. Inside, however, uncertainty clung to every word spoken. Contradictions were forming, not just in facts, but in tone. Mrs. Copley, once adamant, now flustered and inconsistent. Peter, too calm for someone with a motive. Binns, withholding detail until pressed. And Hilda, too composed to be fully honest. When the questioning ended, Miss Marple lingered. Craddock rubbed his brow. They're all lying, or half-lying. Not lying, Inspector, Miss Marple said. They're protecting something, or someone. Craddock frowned. Whom? That, she said softly, is what we're about to find out. But I can tell you one thing. It's not about jealousy, or grief, or money. It's about something buried, something that was meant to stay hidden, but didn't. She reached into her handbag and handed him a slip of paper. This arrived from the bishop's office. You might find it interesting. Craddock unfolded it, eyes narrowing as he read. A record of a burial certificate from 15 years ago. A child. Declared dead at birth. But the name scrawled beside it had been struck through in red ink and replaced with a second, handwritten in a different hand. Peter Blaine. Miss Marple looked toward the church. Sometimes forgiveness is not what people ask for, it's what they beg others never to grant. Inspector Craddock read the burial document 3 times before speaking. The air seemed to thicken with each passing second, and Miss Marple, calm and unreadable as ever, waited without pushing. Are you certain this is accurate? He asked finally, his voice low. I've no reason to believe the bishop's clerk would fabricate parish records, Miss Marple replied. But the more pressing question is not what's on the certificate, it's what it means to those involved. Craddock looked at the struck-out name, then at the replacement. Peter. Blaine was recorded as stillborn and then re-entered. That's not just irregular, it's impossible without intent. Miss Marple gave a slow nod. Intent is the key word here, Inspector. Someone made a deliberate change. And someone else, I suspect, wanted it to remain buried. The Reverend Greaves had begun looking into past registrations. He must have come across this alteration. Perhaps he even confronted the person responsible. Which means, Craddock said, eyes narrowing, someone had a secret worth killing for. Back at the vicarage, Miss Marple sat alone in the sunroom, the burial certificate laid neatly beside her knitting. Her mind moved quietly through what she now knew. Peter had motive, yes, but so did others. The truth was no longer simply about a young man spurned by love or a vicar silenced to protect reputations. It was about identity, lineage, and perhaps inheritance. What began as a murder investigation was unraveling into something deeper, an intentional rewriting of someone's place in the world. She began mapping it mentally, recalling years of observation in Milchester and the relationships that had once seemed so simple. The Reverend had known Peter's mother, Eleanor Blaine, intimately during the war years. She had worked in the church office, unmarried and secretive. When she died, Peter had been just 8, taken in by a distant cousin. It had never struck anyone as odd at the time, but now there was a certificate suggesting Peter was listed as stillborn, until someone changed that. It implied one of two things. Either Peter wasn't who he believed himself to be, or someone had tried very hard to hide who he really was. The next morning, Miss Marple visited the solicitor's office near the village square. Mr. Tobias Kent, a tired man with watery eyes and a tendency to misplace his spectacles, greeted her without enthusiasm until she asked in a gentle tone whether the Reverend had recently requested any documents pertaining to parish, land titles or property transfers. Well, Kent muttered, shuffling through a tray of envelopes. He did inquire about the old endowment deed. The Greaves family donated a parcel to the parish a generation ago. Nothing of value, just a bit of land near the church. Was it in his name? She asked. Kent adjusted his glasses. Technically, yes. The Reverend's personal family trust held it, but it's always been treated as church property. Has anyone tried to claim it recently? Kent hesitated. Now that you mention it, someone did request a copy of the deed a few weeks back. A young woman, didn't give a name, just said she was researching village holdings. Miss Marple's lips pressed into a line. Was it Miss Hilda Greaves? Kent looked unsure. Could have been. I assumed it was some assistant of his. She thanked him and left quietly. Outside, the street smelled of coming rain, and the clouds overhead had begun to gather in thick grey layers. She returned to the church, but this time did not go to the vestry. Instead, she walked the edge of the graveyard to the south corner, where a crumbling stone wall bordered a small grove of unkempt trees. It was there she found the old boundary marker, almost swallowed by ivy, and behind it, a rusted iron gate, barely visible from the path. Land that had once been part of the parish, now nearly forgotten. Back at the vicarage, she found Hilda waiting on the porch, coat in hand. Miss Marple, she said, her voice controlled. Might I speak with you? They sat in the sitting room, the silence between them taut with unspoken knowledge. Hilda looked down, then up, as though making a decision mid-breath. My uncle found something he wasn't meant to, she said quietly. It wasn't just about Peter. It was about me. Miss Marple didn't respond, letting her speak freely. I'm not really a Greaves, she went on. Not by blood. My mother was someone else. Uncle Lionel raised me after her death, gave me his name. He always treated me kindly. But when he discovered the land deed had been altered, and that someone was trying to claim the trust in my name, she paused, her throat tightening. He realized someone had used me. Miss Marple's gaze did not waver. Used you to gain access to the property? Yes. There's been talk of a bypass coming through the southern edge. Developers, have already made offers. If the land belonged to a private heir, not the church, it would be worth thousands." "And who was behind this scheme?" Miss Marple asked gently. "I don't know for certain," Hilda said, "but I saw Peter talking to Mr. Kent's clerk the day before I left. And later, a man from the city, someone I'd never seen, visited him at the cottage. After that, Peter became desperate for me to return. He wrote again and again asking me to come back. I think he needed my signature." Miss Marple leaned back, her hands folded. "So your uncle intervened?" Hilda nodded. "He confronted Peter. I overheard them arguing in the vestry the day before Uncle's death. Peter was shouting about being lied to all his life." Miss Marple let the silence return. The pieces were aligning. Peter, the false certificate, the forgotten land, Hilda's concealed parentage. Everyone involved had something to lose or gain. At sunset, she returned once more to the church. Craddock was already there, waiting, hands in his pockets. "I've been asking more questions," he said without preamble. "Turns out Eleanor Blaine had a stillbirth documented in another village, but the child was buried under a different name. No trace of Peter." "Because Peter," Miss Marple said softly, "wasn't her child at all. He was adopted privately, perhaps illegally, and someone rewrote the records to make it seem natural." Craddock nodded slowly. "So when the Reverend found that certificate, he knew Peter's past had been falsified," she said. "And when he realized Hilda's inheritance was being manipulated to launder that lie, he decided to act. He confronted Peter, possibly gave him a chance to come clean. But someone panicked." Craddock ran a hand down his face. "And the bell." "A distraction," she said. "Or a signal. Perhaps Peter wanted someone to come, or wanted to draw attention to something else. Or maybe he simply didn't want the death to go unnoticed. Guilt has strange habits." Craddock exhaled, long and slow. "We need proof." Miss Marple gave him a faint smile. "We're closer than you think. Because the note, the one that said forgive, was written on paper torn from the church. Hymnal, but not the one in the vestry. It was from the organist's bench. I checked." Craddock's eyes widened. "So Peter was there?" "Yes. And he left a message, not for us, but for himself. It wasn't repentance, it was confession." Craddock straightened. "Then it's time we asked him directly." But Miss Marple raised a hand. "Wait, because there's one more lie, tangled in this web, and it didn't come from Peter." Rain arrived with the dawn, soft and persistent, washing over Milchester's rooftops in a steady rhythm that muffled the usual clatter of the village morning. Inside the police station, the mood had shifted from cautious inquiry to quiet satisfaction. Inspector Craddock stood before a table littered with reports, a typed statement, and a folded hymnal. The last piece had tipped the scale, torn, clearly, missing a page, and found tucked beneath Peter Blaine's organ stool. Combined with the burial certificate, the land dispute, and Peter's erratic behavior, it painted a compelling portrait of a man cornered by truth and desperate to silence the one who had unearthed it. Peter had been brought in quietly, just after breakfast. No resistance, no pleas. He sat in the holding room, hands clasped tightly in his lap, staring at the floor with a look of stunned resignation. When Craddock read him the findings, Peter hadn't denied being in the church that night. He only said in a low, flat voice, "I just wanted to talk to him. That's all." To the constables, that was enough. Craddock drafted a preliminary report. The newspapers would frame it as a tragic tale of obsession and unraveling secrets. The Reverend Greaves, a man of quiet virtue, murdered by a young man, misled by his own past. And yet, as Miss Marple stood beside the window of the vicarage watching the rain collect in small rivulets along the sill, she felt none of the relief that usually accompanied the end of an investigation. Instead, a quiet discomfort nagged at her, subtle but unshakable. Something was wrong. She replayed every moment in her mind. The midnight bell, the bruised temple, the forged certificate, the oil on the gate, the word forgive. And Peter, had confessed to being there, but not to the act itself. Nor had he attempted to flee or destroy evidence. He'd waited. That struck her as peculiar. A man who kills in panic does not wait for arrest. Nor does he leave a message behind if guilt is unbearable. He leaves a note to explain. But Peter had left behind only silence and compliance. She visited Craddock that afternoon, her umbrella dripping near the door as she stepped inside. "You've made your arrest," she said. "But have you made sense of the bell?" Craddock looked up from his paperwork, visibly tired. "It was Rung. We know that. Likely from the tower. His fingerprints were on the ladder railing, enough to place him up there. And yet the bell rope wasn't disturbed," Miss Marple reminded him. "And the smudge on the wheel? Only one, no trailing marks. You can't ring a heavy bell without pulling it hard and steady. That would leave a pattern. Not one faint touch." Craddock blinked, then frowned. "You think he faked it? Used something else to ring it?" "No, Inspector. I think someone else rang it. Or triggered it from below using a counterweight or mechanism. A distraction, nothing more." Craddock leaned back, silent for a moment. "It fits, Jane. The motive, the evidence, he had every reason. But no benefit," she replied. "Only collapse. His future gone. No effort to protect himself. No attempt to blame another. He said he only wanted to talk. And perhaps he did," Miss Marple said. "But someone else ensured that talk never happened." That evening, as the rain lightened to a mist, she paid another visit to the church. It was empty, dimly lit by flickering oil lamps on the side walls. She moved toward the vestry with careful steps, listening not to the silence but to the memory of it. The door creaked faintly on its hinges, untouched since the day of the death, save for police movement. The blood had long since been scrubbed. From the floor, the carpet straightened, but Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the corner behind the coat rack again. Not the plank this time, but the wall. A small, discoloured square of paint. Something had hung there once and had been recently removed. She looked around. Nothing was out of place. But what had once been there? She returned to the main chapel and found Mr. Binns preparing the altar for the next morning's prayers. "Mr. Binns," she said gently, "I wonder if you might remember, was there ever a small frame or plaque hung in the vestry corner?" He blinked. "Yes, ma'am. The Reverend kept an old photograph there. A woman. I always thought it was his sister." "And has it been removed?" He looked confused. "Come to think of it, yes, it's gone." That night, Miss Marple sat alone by the fire, knitting untouched in her lap, thinking of the photograph. The Reverend's sister had died young, long, before Hilda had come to stay. But what if the woman in the picture had not been a sister at all? What if she had been Peter's mother, or someone who knew the truth of Peter's origins? And what if that photograph had been the final threat, proof enough that the Reverend could unravel everything? The next morning, Peter was moved to the county jail for formal arraignment. Craddock remained in Milchester, preparing the closing report. Miss Marple asked one final favour, to speak with Hilda Greaves once more. They met in the churchyard, near the south wall where the boundary land lay wet and forgotten behind the trees. Hilda stood wrapped in a dark coat, her face pale against the grey sky. "I came here often as a child," she said quietly. "Uncle would bring me to visit the graves, to teach me the history of the parish. He said you could learn more about people from how they were remembered than how they lived." Miss Marple didn't respond immediately. "The photograph in the vestry," she said at last. "Do you remember it?" Hilda's expression shifted. Her eyes lowered. "Yes, it was my mother." "Then you must know," Miss Marple said gently, "that Peter recognized her There was silence. "I think," Miss Marple continued, "that Peter believed she was his mother too. Or perhaps he feared it. Either way, he came to confront the Reverend. But someone else already knew what he would find, and removed the one thing that would confirm it." Hilda's breath hitched, her voice trembling. "You think I killed him?" "I think you lied," Miss Marple replied. "Not to hide guilt, but to protect someone. Or perhaps yourself. But lies have a shape, Miss Greaves, and your uncle uncovered one too large to cover again." Hilda turned away, looking out over the stone wall. He was going to write to the bishop. Tell them everything. Resign, sell the land, give Peter what was his, and leave me nothing. Miss Marple waited. "I didn't mean to," Hilda whispered, then stopped. But Miss Marple shook her head. "You didn't strike him, I know that. But you distracted him, delayed him, created just enough time for someone else to do it." Hilda's voice cracked. Mrs. Copley heard the bell. She came running. But she didn't come straight to the vestry. She went to the gate first, to check if anyone had seen. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "She's always been loyal," Hilda said, "to our family, even when she shouldn't have been." And in that moment Miss Marple understood. The Reverend had discovered a truth that would upend the lives of those closest to him. One had stood still, paralyzed by guilt. Another had erased the proof. And a third, faithful, devoted, fearful, had done what she believed had to be done. The real criminal had not yet struck, because she had already acted. The rain had ceased by the following morning, leaving the village soaked in a hush that seemed to linger in the hedges and eaves. Miss Marple rose early, as was her custom, and sat by the window of the vicarage drawing-room with her tea, watching thin rays of light break through the clouds over the bell tower. Though the official line was being wrapped up, Peter's confession, Hilda's evasions, the land deeds and altered birth records, there remained, deep in her mind, an unease she could not shake. Not about the murder, for she believed she now understood the hand that had dealt the fatal blow, but about the context, the pattern, the long shadow, stretching backward from Reverend Greaves's death into something older and unfinished. That feeling deepened when Inspector Craddock arrived with a bundle of old parish records, freshly collected from the church's archival cabinet. "Thought you might want a look before I ship them off to the county office," he said, placing them on the low table. "There's something off about this whole affair, Jane. It's as though we've been handed a puzzle where all the pieces fit, but the picture's still wrong." She nodded, sorting through the aging folders. "Yes, because we've treated it as a modern crime. But it's not. It's a continuation." He frowned. "Of what?" Miss Marple pulled a thin file from the middle of the stack, its edges soft with age. "This." It was a register of burials and christenings from 1946, the year Eleanor Blaine arrived in Milchester. The same year the Reverend Lionel Greaves first took over the parish after his return from the war. Tucked between the pages was a loose paper, a faded letter addressed in old ink to Reverend Thomas Greaves, Lionel's predecessor and late father. The postmark was nearly illegible, but the return address bore a London orphanage's name. Miss W. Marple's eyes scanned the letter slowly, lips pressing tighter with each line. "It's a notice of claim," she said, "from the orphanage, regarding a newborn child whose mother died during labour. No relatives, no named father. The child was to be placed in care." Craddock leaned over, and the Reverend's father intervened. She tapped the edge of the page. "It seems he did. The letter mentions a private arrangement, no adoption. Records. Just an informal placement." "Peter," Craddock murmured. "No surname given at the time," she said. "But it aligns with the timeline, and explains why the official records were tampered with later, to make it appear as though Peter had always belonged here." "But why the deception?" Craddock asked. Why would Thomas Greaves bring a child into the parish under false pretenses? Miss Marple folded her hands. Perhaps out of guilt, or perhaps because that child was more than a foundling. Craddock gave her a look. "You're not saying—" "I'm saying Eleanor Blaine came to Milchester that same month, that she worked in the church office, that she left suddenly after Peter's second birthday, and that Thomas Greaves retired unexpectedly the following spring. You think Peter was his child. I think Reverend Lionel Greaves believed—" "So," Miss Marple said, "whether it was true or not." Craddock looked troubled. "So the Reverend uncovered not just a legal scandal, but a family disgrace." Miss Marple nodded, which might explain why he delayed acting even when he discovered the false records, and why he might have felt the need to atone. Perhaps that's what the word forgive meant, not a plea from the killer, but a final burden the Reverend wished to lift himself. Craddock sat down heavily. "But that changes everything." "It clarifies everything," Miss Marple corrected softly. "Peter was manipulated. Hilda was used. The housekeeper, Mrs. Copley, acted out of blind loyalty, believing she was protecting the Greaves name. But the roots of this tragedy lie in 1946. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited the church alone. The building had regained its stillness. The dust of investigation settled back into pews and corners. She walked once more to the vestry, knelt at the plank behind the coat rack, and this time lifted it completely. Beneath was the hidden box she had suspected earlier. She opened it slowly. Inside were letters, 24 or more, carefully bundled, written in the same neat hand. All addressed to Thomas Greaves. Some signed by Eleanor, others unsigned but unmistakably intimate. She read only enough to understand. Eleanor had loved him. Whether he had returned that love was less clear, but he had protected her nonetheless. And in the final months before his retirement he had instructed Lionel to preserve Peter's future. But Lionel, proud, devout, bound to duty, had not erased the truth. He had only buried it, hoping perhaps that it would never surface. And now it had. Miss Marple stood, replaced the plank, and stepped into the nave, where the light from the stained glass windows threw soft colours over the stone floor. As she turned to leave, she heard a soft rustle behind her. Mrs. Copley stood near the chapel doors, eyes red-rimmed but steady. "I knew," she said, "about the baby, about Mr. Thomas. I was there when she came." Miss Marple did not speak, only listened. "Swore I'd keep it quiet," the housekeeper continued. "When Mr. Lionel found out, truly found out, he was shattered. Said he had to make it right. Said Peter deserved the truth." Miss Marple's voice was barely above a whisper. "You thought the truth would destroy everything." Mrs. Copley nodded, tears spilling now. "I didn't mean to. I only meant to stop him from sending the letter to the bishop. I followed him that night. He was in the vestry. I told him to wait, to think. He wouldn't listen." "What did you do?" "I pushed him," she said simply. "He tripped. Hit the edge of the writing desk. It was so quick." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. "And the bell?" "I rang it after, so someone would find him, so it wouldn't look like I left him there." Miss Marple did not ask why she hadn't come forward sooner. She already knew. The weight of decades, loyalty, fear, the desire to protect a crumbling ideal had made the truth too heavy to carry into daylight. But now it had come regardless. As she left the church, the wind stirred in the trees, lifting the last of the rain from the leaves. The past, long buried, had emerged not as scandal, but as sorrow. A history shaped by shame, by silence, and by the simple human failure to speak before it was too late. Miss Marple returned to the vicarage in silence, the sound of Mrs. Copley's quiet confession still echoing in her mind. The pieces of the puzzle had settled into place with a kind of grim inevitability, Yet something in her manner betrayed unfinished work. Though the mechanism of the crime was now clear, the accidental push, the bell rung in panic, the concealment, born of misguided loyalty, it was not closure she felt, but a stillness. A pause before the final breath of a long-kept secret exhaled fully. There remained one thread, nearly invisible, that refused to lie flat. The photograph missing from the vestry wall. She retrieved her notes, reviewed her visits, and stared again at the statements made over the past week. Everyone had skirted around that detail, as though the photograph's removal had been a matter too delicate or too trivial to mention. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that trivialities were the very things that undid liars, and so she turned her mind to the photograph, not to what it showed, but to who had remembered it. Mrs. Copley had claimed it was the Reverend's sister. Mr. Binns had believed the same, but Hilda had called the woman her mother, and Peter had said nothing at all. No questions about its absence, no reaction to its mention. That silence was no accident. The next morning, she went to the cottage where Peter was being held under guard, pending formal charges, which by now were being quietly dropped in light of the new confession. Craddock, though still wary, allowed her a brief supervised conversation. Peter sat on the bench in the constable's office, arms folded, eyes dull but alert. "You were a child when you first saw the photograph," she began, voice mild. "Weren't you?" Peter didn't answer at first. "I suppose," he said eventually. "It was always there. I didn't think about it." "But you recognized her," Miss Marple continued. "You just never told anyone." Peter gave a faint shrug. "What would I have said? I didn't know her name, only the look, like something familiar but out of reach. You don't say those things aloud, not in a place like this." "You don't," she agreed. "But someone else does. Someone who fears what a look like that might mean. Someone who removes a photograph before it speaks." Peter looked at her sharply then, the first real emotion flickering through his face. "Who?" Miss Marple let the silence stretch. "I believe the photograph wasn't removed by Mrs. Copley," she said softly. "She's never had a mind for such premeditation. But someone else, someone cleverer, had both motive and access." Peter leaned forward. "Who?" he asked again, quieter now. "Hilda," Miss Marple said, watching him closely. "She returned to Milchester with purpose, but not to grieve, to secure a truth she feared might surface." Peter's jaw set. "She wouldn't—" "She already had," Miss Marple said gently. "I asked the bishop's office to confirm something. There were 2 letters sent to them from Milchester in the same week, the first by your uncle, the second, withdrawn 2 days later, by Hilda Greaves, claiming he had changed his mind and no further action was necessary." Peter stared at her, blinking slowly. "She forged his name," Miss Marple continued. "She knew what was coming. She must have overheard him dictating the letter. She intercepted it, rewrote it, and sent her own. But he was going to give me the land. She stood to lose it," Miss Marple said, "and more, she stood to lose the story she'd been told all her life, that she was the true heir to the Greaves trust, that she belonged here. It isn't always greed, Peter. Sometimes it's fear. Sometimes it's identity." She thought she was protecting herself. Peter looked away, but Miss Marple saw the tremor that passed through his fingers. It was not rage, it was grief. Grief for the lie, for the shattered shape of belonging he had only begun to claim. Miss Marple stood. "I don't tell you this to accuse her. That's not my place. The law will judge what must be judged. But I thought you deserved to know that she wasn't only hiding the truth from the world, she was hiding it from you." Outside the constable's office, Miss Marple found Craddock waiting in the corridor, arms folded. "You think he believed her?" he asked. "I think he did," she said, and I think she believed herself, until the facts intruded. Craddock followed her outside into the weak sun of the late afternoon. "You said you had an idea to test something?" "I do," she replied, turning toward the church. "But it isn't proof I need. It's reaction." Later that day, under pretense of closing the vestry and securing the parish records, Miss Marple invited Hilda Greaves to assist her. "There are some items that need cataloguing before the bishop's representative arrives," she explained. Hilda agreed with cool composure. Inside the vestry, Miss Marple stood by the coat rack and pulled out a folded paper from her handbag. "Before we finish, I'd like to show you something." Hilda looked briefly wary. "Of course." Miss Marple handed her the paper, a reproduction of the original photograph that had hung on the wall, copied from a record held at the bishop's archive. "Do you recognize her?" Hilda's breath caught. "She's my mother," Hilda said. "Quickly. Are you sure?" "Yes." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Even though the original photograph was taken in 1945? There was a pause, short but too long. Hilda's hand twitched. "That's what Uncle always said. And yet she appears in a group photograph at a London Red Cross hospital in May of that year," Miss Marple said quietly, "under another name, not Greaves." Hilda's eyes darkened. "She's Peter's mother," Miss Marple finished, "not yours. And you knew." Hilda stared at her for a long moment, then, with a kind of brittle grace, placed the photograph on the desk and turned away. "It doesn't matter now," she said. "It always matters," Miss Marple replied. "Because you removed the photograph before your uncle's death, not to protect Peter, to protect yourself." Hilda didn't answer, but she didn't deny it. The final piece had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but with quiet finality. And Miss Marple, satisfied, let the silence do what no further questioning could. The wind picked up that evening, sweeping over the gravestones and stirring the hedges along the edge of the vicarage garden. Inside, Miss Marple sat quietly in her usual chair, her fingers still, the knitting basket untouched beside her. Though she had carefully manoeuvred Hilda into confronting the truth, and though Mrs. Copley had confessed her part in the fatal event, the feeling of finality refused to settle. Something remained unsettled, not in motive or character, but in the trail of evidence itself. She had seen this before, a case that seemed to lock neatly into place only to be undone by a single missing thread. Inspector Craddock had left for the county office with the signed statements, satisfied for now with what had been pieced together. He had asked Miss Marple, half with jest, if she was finally content. She had smiled, but her reply had been vague. For though she had everything she needed, testimonies, timelines, cause and effect, one thing tugged at her more strongly now than ever, the hidden box beneath the vestry plank. She had opened it days ago. She had seen the letters. She had replaced them exactly where she'd found them, awaiting the right time to reveal them. But when she returned the next morning, just before first light, her lantern in hand and the church key borrowed from the constable's office, the vestry felt wrong. The scent of dust was sharper, disturbed. The stillness had a tension to it. She knelt, heart steady, and lifted the plank. The box was gone. She stood slowly, her face unreadable, then swept her lantern across the floor. There were faint scuff marks, recent ones, near the wall. Someone had returned in the night. Someone had known what was hidden. She locked the vestry carefully behind her and made her way to the church office. Nothing else had been disturbed. The filing drawers were still sealed, the altar untouched. But the loss of those letters changed everything, not just in form, but in message. Someone had not merely removed them. Someone had known they existed. which meant someone had either followed her or had long known what was beneath that floor. Back. At the vicarage, Miss Marple found Peter in the sitting room with a book unopened in his lap. Since the charges had been formally dropped, he had remained under quiet supervision until Craddock completed his report. He looked up as she entered, but her expression made him sit up straighter. "The letters are gone," she said plainly. "Someone removed the entire box." His brow furrowed. "Why?" "Because they feared what the letters would prove. Not just about the past, but about who acted with full knowledge and who only guessed." She sat down opposite him, hands folded. "The one who took the letters didn't take them to protect your mother's reputation. They took them to destroy the last proof that you are who you were always meant to be." Peter's throat moved. "Hilda." "She never knew the letters existed," Miss Marple said. "She lied about the photograph, lied about the bishop's letter, but she would not have guessed about the compartment beneath the floor. That was something I discovered privately." Peter frowned. "Then who?" "Someone who's been here longer. Someone who knew about the old church layout. Someone who, when faced with the vicar's intentions, acted not out of impulse, but strategy." Peter's eyes widened. "Mrs. Copley." Miss Marple nodded slowly. She was the only one who could have removed the letters without drawing attention. She knew where they were because she saw me lift the plank. She likely came that night while I was speaking with Craddock. "The box is gone, Peter. But it wasn't to protect the Reverend. It was to erase the chain linking the family secret to you. She did it to keep the Greaves name whole, even now." Peter stood, hands at his sides. "Then she lied. Her confession was—" "Not entirely untrue," Miss Marple interrupted. "I believe she did push him. But I believe she had spoken with Hilda first. I believe they agreed, spoken or not, that the truth must not come out. Mrs. Copley did what she thought she must. But now she's protecting something else. Not just a memory, a legacy." Later that day, as Inspector Craddock returned, Miss Marple relayed the disappearance of the letters. Craddock was visibly angered, though not surprised. "Then someone's trying to control the story. You think it's Copley?" "I think it was both women. In their own ways," she said. "Hilda tried to manipulate outcomes. Mrs. Copley tried to erase them. But what matters now is what we still have," Craddock exhaled. "Which is—" "The truth," Miss Marple said, "and perhaps one more chance to catch them in it." They devised a plan, not complicated, but precise. That evening, Miss Marple invited Hilda and Mrs. Copley to tea under the pretense of settling final parish affairs. She placed the reproduction of the missing photograph in full view on the sideboard, visible but not remarked upon. Then, casually, she mentioned that the bishop's clerk would be arriving to retrieve a bundle of letters, which she described vaguely as correspondence related to Reverend Thomas's war years, some quite sensitive, I'm told. Neither woman flinched, but Miss Marple saw what she needed. Hilda's gaze flicked briefly to Mrs. Copley, then away. The housekeeper's knuckles tightened around her cup. The next morning, a constable reported a break-in attempt at the rear of the vicarage. An unlocked window disturbed muddy prints just inside the pantry. Nothing stolen, but clearly someone had entered, searching for something. Miss Marple smiled thinly. "They think I've hidden the letters here now." Craddock's face hardened. "They're panicking." "Yes," she said. "And people who panic make mistakes." The following night she returned once more to the vestry. Not to search, but to leave a new trail. A small note, carefully aged with tea, placed in the hollow beneath the plank. It read only, "Photograph, 1931, Oxford. Ask the bishop." She made sure word of her visit reached the right ears. The trap was set, and somewhere, in the dark hours before dawn, someone would return, desperate, trembling, and no longer in control. The Storm broke again just past midnight, as if summoned deliberately. Thunder rolled over Milchester's hills in deep, rumbling waves, and rain battered the old panes of the vicarage windows with increasing urgency. Miss Marple, fully dressed and seated in her armchair near the front room, remained still, eyes fixed on the clock ticking steadily toward 2. Her trap had been laid with precision, the note tucked in the vestry floorboard, a hint of an Oxford photograph that never existed, a planted rumour that the bishop's office would be reopening old files. It was the kind of nudge that could force a concealed hand to reveal itself, and now all she had to do was wait. But it was not the sound of a footfall at the church or the squeak of a gate hinge that arrived first. It was the constable. Breathless, soaked through, he appeared at her door and knocked with urgency. When she opened it, his eyes were wide. "There's been an incident," he said. "At the church." She followed him at once, no time to fetch her shawl. The rain hit her skin like cold needles as they crossed the square and reached the chapel's side entrance, where a second officer stood guard. Craddock was already inside, jaw set, coat clinging to him like a second skin. The moment he saw her, he stepped aside, revealing the open vestry. The floorboard had been lifted again, but this time it was splintered at the edges, as if someone had torn at it in desperation. The false note she had left behind was gone. And beside the gaping hole was the body of Mrs. Copley, collapsed on her side, face pale and mouth slack. Her handbag lay inches from her outstretched hand, its contents spilled, a single black envelope clutched loosely between her fingers. "She's alive," Craddock said grimly. "But only barely. Poison. She drank something before she came. We found the bottle in the garden near the sacristy door. A suicide attempt, looks like." Miss Marple stepped carefully inside, kneeling by the housekeeper. A faint, ragged breath trembled from the woman's lips. "She came here tonight not to retrieve the note," Miss Marple said softly, "but to destroy it." Craddock frowned. "She believed it real?" "Of course she did, and she panicked, but there's more." She reached down and gently pried the black envelope from Mrs. Copley's hand. Inside, a single page, creased and faintly damp, bore the handwriting of Reverend Lionel Greaves. It was a draft, likely never posted. A letter addressed to the bishop, explaining the truth about Peter's parentage, the forged records, and the intention to name him heir to the Greaves trust. It was dated the morning before his death. "She must have found it after the murder," Miss Marple whispered. "Or perhaps he left it out that night, intending to send it after their conversation. She's kept it hidden ever since." Craddock exhaled. And now she believed another copy existed. The photograph note pushed her over the edge. "Miss," Marple nodded. She came to destroy the last piece of a truth she could no longer control. But what she didn't expect was the poison working faster than her resolve. They called for a doctor, and Mrs. Copley was taken to the infirmary in critical condition, her fate uncertain. Craddock remained at the church, ordering a search of the vestry and garden for anything else the woman may have concealed or attempted to destroy. Miss Marple returned to the vicarage with a strange, sinking weight pressing on her chest. The letter was damning, yes, but it also proved that Reverend Greaves had not died in moral ambiguity. He had been on the cusp of righting what had been wronged long ago. But that moment of clarity was shattered just before dawn. A second knock came. This time it was Peter, his eyes wide, rain dripping from his hair. He stood framed in the vicarage doorway, soaked again, but this time not with shock. "She's gone," he said. "Hilda. Her room's empty. She's taken the train to London. Left an hour ago. Left no note." Miss Marple didn't hesitate. She ushered him inside, motioned to the kettle, but already her thoughts had leapt forward. The timing was too precise. Mrs. Copley's suicide attempt, the revelation of the draft letter, the trap laid at the vestry, Hilda had known or guessed that everything was about to collapse, and she had acted accordingly. Craddock arrived not long after, his mood grim. The station master confirmed it. She took the early express. No luggage. One-way ticket. Miss Marple sat silently. She knew Mrs. Copley would go to the church tonight. Perhaps she pushed her to it, suggested that the note proved something worse. Craddock nodded, and then disappeared before the fallout. But not before retrieving something else, Miss Marple said. I had left a second item in the vestry drawer, an empty folder labelled Bishop's Correspondence, Oxford 1931. It was for show, nothing inside. But it's gone. Craddock's brow furrowed. She's still trying to control the narrative. She's lost control, Miss Marple replied, and that's what makes her dangerous now. Outside, the sky brightened without cheer. The storm passed, but the wind still unsettled. The village was beginning to stir, unaware of how close it had come to bearing witness to a second death, or worse, a complete erasure of the truth. For now, Peter remained safe. The Reverend's letter was in official hands. But Hilda was gone, and her absence was not surrender. It was strategy. Miss Marple watched the trees shift in the breeze and said, almost to herself, "She won't run far. Not while something remains to reclaim." Craddock looked at her. "Then what do we do now?" "We wait," she said, "and we prepare, because she's not finished, and she will return, not in shame, but with an excuse, a new version of the story, and perhaps a plan to silence the truth once and for all." And though the storm outside had passed, Miss Marple knew the storm within was only just beginning. The hours following Hilda's disappearance passed with quiet strain. The storm had cleared, but Milchester wore the uneasy stillness that follows, a disruption no one fully understands. At the vicarage, Peter remained under quiet observation, and Mrs. Copley hovered in critical condition at the infirmary, unresponsive but alive. The stolen letters would never be recovered, and Hilda had vanished into the great fog of London with nothing but her name and the weight of what she'd tried to conceal. And yet, despite the mounting damage and the tangle of lies, something still eluded Miss Marple, not a fact, but a shape. A structure that had existed from the start, too familiar to be noticed. She walked slowly through the village that morning, not out of obligation, but instinct. The church tower cast long shadows over the graveyard, and the birds returned to their ordinary calls. The world was recovering, but her thoughts kept circling a single recollection: the photograph, not the image itself, but its absence. Hilda had removed it because she feared what it revealed. Mrs. Copley had tried to protect what it represented, but Miss Marple found herself turning not to the picture, but to what had hung beside it for years. An old brass wall sconce, decorative, and mostly ignored. She remembered it now because of a small detail she had barely registered on her last visit, its angle. Slightly tilted, as if someone had bumped it and not bothered to straighten it. She returned to the vestry immediately, entered alone, and examined the sconce closely. Its backplate was affixed to the panelling, but poorly. One screw had been loosened. When she gently removed it, a folded page fell behind it, brittle with age. Not one of the vicar's letters. It was older. A telegram. She unfolded it carefully, and her eyes narrowed as she read, "Regret to inform death of Eleanor Blaine, registered previously incorrect. Child alive. Arrangements made. Confirm instructions. St. John's Orphanage. The date, 1946. The same month Eleanor had supposedly died in childbirth. Miss Marple stood still for a long moment. The message didn't just correct the past. It confirmed what she had begun to suspect. Not only had the truth been altered, but someone had known it from the very beginning and built their entire life on keeping it buried. But who had placed the telegram there? Thomas Greaves or Lionel? Years later, after rediscovering what his father had hidden, she folded the telegram into her handbag and stepped back into the nave, where Craddock waited, his coat collar damp from the morning's drizzle. "I believe I've found what we were missing," she said without preamble. The first lie. Followed her back to the vicarage, and there, with tea on the table between them, she laid it out like a puzzle finally forming its image. Everything began with this telegram. Eleanor Blaine was never dead. Her child, Peter, was hidden, his records falsified, and his existence placed under the control of those who thought they could manage it. Craddock nodded. "We assumed the Reverend discovered the truth later in life." "But he knew far earlier," Miss Marple said. "I believe he found this telegram among his father's effects when he took over the parish, and I believe he left it behind, hidden, but not destroyed, because he could not bring himself to undo what had been done. Until now." Craddock's expression darkened. "And Hilda?" "She was never meant to inherit anything. The Greaves name, the land, the legacy. It was passed to her not by right but by silence. And the Reverend's decision to finally correct the record threatened the foundation she'd built her life upon." "She panicked," Craddock murmured, "pushed Mrs. Copley into acting, and then fled when it spiraled out of control." "But she didn't just flee," Miss Marple said. "She tried to take the last pieces of proof with her, first the letters, then the planted note. She feared not just exposure, but irrelevance, that everything she claimed as hers, her home, her past, her family, might be stripped away." Craddock sat back frowning. "You said you saw a pattern. What was it?" Miss Marple's voice lowered. "Control. That's what this has been about from the beginning. Each action, each carefully placed clue or suppressed detail, has been part of a long pattern of control, not simply to cover up a death, but to shape a narrative." She stood and walked to the fireplace, gesturing at the photographs on the mantel, parish gatherings, festival processions, community events. In each, Hilda stood near the Reverend, a silent figure just behind his shoulder. She'd always been there, watching, waiting, learning. She watched how decisions were made. She learned where things were stored. And when the time came, she stepped into that role without question. But she never accepted Peter as a threat until he asked for the truth. That's what triggered all of this. Not love, not jealousy. Truth. Craddock rose slowly. "She won't stay gone." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "She's built too much of herself into the Greaves name to let it go quietly. She'll return. But now we know how she thinks. And when she does, we'll be ready." Outside, the sun broke through, weak but steady. The village exhaled as if bracing for the next gust of wind. But within the walls of the vicarage, something had shifted. Not resolution yet, but understanding. The pattern had emerged, and though it had taken the shape of grief, deception, and loss, it now pointed forward, toward the final confrontation, toward the last truth still waiting to be named. The days that followed unfolded in uneasy calm. Hilda's absence still hung like an unfinished sentence over Milchester, but the atmosphere had changed. The villagers sensed that something unspoken had happened, something too complex to gossip about properly and too serious for simple speculation. The police presence thinned, reports were compiled, and official hands began closing the case on paper. But Miss Marple knew the real ending had not yet occurred. The structure had been revealed, yes, but the driving force behind it, the true source of everything, had remained half-seen, moving silently beneath the surface like a shadow beneath the ice. She spent the following afternoon at the Reverend's study desk, going through the drawers once more, not for evidence, but for understanding. There, among sermon notes and neatly labelled correspondence, she found an old folder marked Pastoral Anomalies, a rather clinical name for a collection of quiet crises. Inside were brief records, handwritten notes about private conversations, discreet arrangements for troubled parishioners, and a few sheets of paper concerning Miss Hilda Greaves. Most were benign: school forms, recommendations, a note from a London tutor. But tucked in the back was a page written in a far shakier hand, unsigned but unmistakably Lionel's. She has always shown intensity, beyond what is natural. No cruelty, but an urgency that unnerves. Her certainty frightens even when she is still. I fear that I've failed her by omission, by silence. She watches me. I wonder what she thinks I've done. Miss Marple folded the page slowly. This wasn't just guilt. It was dread. The following morning brought with it the return Miss Marple had anticipated. Hilda Greaves arrived by the mid-morning train, alone, composed, and without explanation. She walked from the station to the vicarage in a tailored coat and gloves, her head high, eyes forward. Craddock, waiting nearby on Miss Marple's quiet recommendation, allowed her to enter the sitting room before stepping in after her. She didn't appear surprised. "I came back because I realized running would only make me look guilty," she said evenly. "And I'm not." Miss Marple nodded once, as if granting permission for the performance to begin. "Of course. But the question is not whether you're guilty of murder. It's whether you're guilty of shaping a life around a lie and punishing anyone who threatened it." Hilda's smile was thin. "You don't know anything." "But I do," Miss Marple replied gently. "I know you weren't raised as Lionel Greaves's niece. You were taken in after your mother died under unclear circumstances. He never publicly acknowledged who she was to him. And you were clever enough to realize that while your connection to him gave you protection, Peter's did the opposite." Hilda's fingers curled on the edge of her gloves. "You didn't act for money," Miss Marple continued, "or even for inheritance. You acted because of identity. You couldn't bear the idea of being replaced, not because you loved the Reverend, but because you needed to be chosen. And you weren't." Craddock shifted but said nothing. "You manipulated Peter," Miss Marple went on, "encouraged his confusion, tried to draw him back when you felt the Reverend drifting toward him. You intercepted the letter to the bishop, forged a retraction, and when that failed, you whispered to Mrs. Copley that the truth would destroy everything she'd devoted her life to. You didn't push Lionel, but you created the pressure that caused someone else to." Hilda exhaled slowly, her voice quiet but sharp. "You speak about me as if I were some monster. I speak about you as someone who lived in the shadow of another's story for too long," Miss Marple said. "And when the shape of that story changed, you couldn't bear it. You had to be the center, not just the heir, not just the name, but the soul of the Greaves legacy." Hilda's voice cracked. "He promised me. He said I was the only one who understood, that I was his strength. He let me believe. He let you believe because he was afraid of what would happen if he didn't," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "He feared your reaction. He feared what you might become." The silence held. Then Craddock, voice carefully measured, said, "You didn't kill him, Miss Greaves, but your actions led to a death. And that, I'm afraid, is something we can pursue." But Hilda's gaze had turned inward, distant. "I didn't want to kill him, I just wanted him to choose. He always said truth was a kind of faith. But he lied to me, and I thought, if he lied to me, maybe I could take the lie back." She didn't resist when she was escorted away. And she didn't speak again. Later that evening, Miss Marple returned to the vestry once more. The church was quiet now, returned to its rhythm of silence and ritual. She stood beneath the tower where the bell had rung and let her thoughts settle. It had never been about a single moment. It had always been about a slow corrosion, the danger of silent promises and roles people were too afraid to question. Hilda, Hadn't killed for money or even revenge. She'd acted because her entire sense of self was built on being necessary, essential, irreplaceable. When the truth endangered that, she'd reached for control, not out of evil, but from a deep, brittle fear. Miss Marple had seen such things before. The most dangerous lies weren't the ones told to others, they were the ones people told themselves. The day after Hilda's quiet return and calculated arrest, Milchester resumed its rhythm, as villages always do when the wind of scandal passes. People spoke in half-sentences and silent glances. No one dared say too much, not because they lacked curiosity, but because the weight of what had happened still pressed on the air like the echo of a funeral bell. But even in that stillness, Miss Marple felt a final disturbance beneath the calm, a lingering sense that one final thread had not been tied, that something remained unspoken, buried not by silence, but by intention. Craddock had been diligent. The bishop's office had received the telegram and the Reverend's unsent confession, and legal processes had begun to restore Peter's name as rightful heir to the Greaves estate. Mrs. Copley remained alive, but too weak to speak, and Hilda, though charged with obstruction, document tampering and accessory to concealment, was calm in custody, offering no further resistance. But she had not confessed, not truly. She had admitted to pressure, influence, interference, but never admitted what Miss Marple now believed she knew with certainty, that Hilda had entered the vestry after Mrs. Copley had pushed the Reverend and instead of helping him had made the choice to let him die. That omission was the final crime. Not the violence of the act, but the violence of inaction. Miss Marple understood it as only someone who had seen the shape of such things across decades could. And she knew it needed more than a legal response. It needed exposure, not for punishment, but for truth. She went to see Hilda one last time. The room Craddock arranged was quiet and plain, not a cell, but not a sitting room either. Hilda sat by the window, pale but composed. When Miss Marple entered, she looked up with the same controlled expression she had always worn, the same poised stillness that had once charmed the village. "You've come to press me again," she said. "No," Miss Marple replied, sitting opposite her. "I've come to let you speak freely, without consequence. Not because the law needs it, but because I think you do." Hilda gave a small, mirthless smile. "I've already said what I had to say." "No, you haven't," Miss Marple said gently. "You've explained your actions, yes? The falsified letter, the manipulation of Mrs. Copley, the photograph. But not the vestry, not the moment that mattered most." Hilda's lips pressed together. "I wasn't there." "You were," Miss Marple said. "Not when she pushed him, but after. You found him barely conscious. You saw the blood, the fall. You could have called for help. But you waited, and you watched." Hilda's eyes narrowed slightly. "You watched," Miss Marple repeated, "because you believed it was fate correcting itself. You believed that, if he died, the story could return to how it had been, you, the chosen heir." "Peter, the complication erased." Hilda's voice came low. "You have no proof." "I don't need it," Miss Marple said calmly. "I have your pattern, the silence, the forged note, the stolen photograph, the planted fear in a woman too devoted to question you. I've watched the way you shift stories to suit the moment. And now I only need your confirmation to complete the truth, not for court, for you." For a long time, Hilda said nothing. Outside, the wind stirred, and footsteps passed in the corridor. Then she spoke softly. "He looked at me," she said. "When I stepped into the vestry, he was lying there trying to sit up. He said my name, barely. I stood there, not moving. I thought, if I called for help, he'd live, and then everything would change. Peter would get it all, and I would become a memory, a mistake." Her voice trembled. "So I waited, just long enough, and when it was too late, I ran. Miss Marple watched her, expression unreadable. "I didn't kill him," Hilda whispered, tears at the corners of her eyes. "I just didn't save him." "That is the crime," Miss Marple said. "Not in the eyes of the law, perhaps, but in the eyes of a conscience that was once clean." Hilda closed her eyes. Miss Marple stood. "You still have time to speak, publicly, to give Peter what you denied him, not land, not wealth, truth." Hilda's shoulders didn't move, but Miss Marple knew the words had struck their mark. Outside, Inspector Craddock was waiting. "Well?" "She said it," Miss Marple replied. "And that's enough for now." Peter was waiting at the vicarage, pacing slowly on the porch. He looked up as she approached, uncertain. "She won't stand in your way anymore," Miss Marple told him. "Not because she's been stopped, but because for the first time she understands what she did." He nodded slowly. "I don't want revenge." "No," she said, placing a hand gently on his arm. "You want peace, and now you'll have it." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long golden beams over the church tower and the path leading from the vestry door, the final bell tolled, not in mourning, nor in alarm, but as a simple mark of time, steady and clear. The truth, once buried beneath old lies and quiet betrayals, had been spoken aloud. And that was enough. The peace that followed Hilda's quiet confession was not loud nor triumphant. It was the kind that settles gently, like dust in a long-shuttered room, disturbed by one final breeze. In the village, life returned to routine. The Reverend's memorial was arranged with dignity, Peter was formally acknowledged as the legal heir, and Hilda, though not imprisoned, had quietly withdrawn from public life under supervision, her name fading into whispers rather than judgment. Mrs. Copley remained in recovery, speaking only occasionally, her eyes full of weight and silence. To the world beyond Milchester, the matter was closed. But Miss Marple, though composed, did not rest easily. Something gnawed at her, not in the open facts of the case, but in the rhythm of its resolution. Too neat, too balanced, as if someone had arranged the pieces just so and slipped away before they could be seen doing it. She returned to the vestry one final time on a warm, cloudless afternoon. The church was quiet, unvisited, the floor still bearing the faint scars of the planks lifted and replaced. She stood by the wall where the sconce had once concealed the telegram, now removed and sealed in official files. Her eyes moved across the small space, not searching but remembering, until they landed on the wooden cabinet where Lionel Greaves had kept his pastoral ledgers. One of its drawers, though locked at the time of initial investigation, had since been opened during inventory. Miss Marple had dismissed it as administrative. Now, she opened it slowly, leafing through the records again, this time with no specific intention. But there, nestled between ledgers, was something that didn't belong, a slip of folded vellum, pressed between pages like a forgotten bookmark. She opened it. A letter, brief, addressed not to the bishop, not to Hilda, but to someone named Edward. "If you're reading this, it means I've failed to stop it. I've hidden the truth too long. You were right. Secrets fester. I've made arrangements. But should something happen, do not trust her. She knows more than she said. She always has. L. There was no surname, just the single initial. But Miss Marple knew the handwriting, and she knew, in that instant, she had made one final miscalculation. She returned to the vicarage at once, where Peter sat in the back garden reading over estate documents. He looked up when she entered, surprised by her urgency. "Peter," she said carefully, "do you know a man named Edward? Someone your uncle might have written to privately?" He blinked. "Edward? That was the church treasurer, Edward Lockley. Retired a few years ago. Moved to Devon. Why? Did he and the Reverend remain in contact?" I think so, Peter said. Uncle mentioned he'd sent him copies of the land titles for safekeeping. Said Edward was the only one who knew the original arrangement between the Greaves Trust and the church. Miss Marple stood still. And was Edward close with anyone here during his time in the parish? Peter considered. Not particularly. Quiet man, though I do remember. He and Mrs. Copley used to speak often. He was always in the kitchen. When he visited, said he couldn't bear formal conversation. Miss Marple's voice dropped. And after he left, who handled the financial documents? Peter looked puzzled. Well, Mrs. Copley, I suppose. She took over much of the bookkeeping. Until Uncle reorganized last year, it fell into place with stunning simplicity. Not Hilda, not entirely. Miss Marple sat down, breath steady, and understood the shape of what she had missed. Mrs. Copley had not simply protected a name. She had managed the story. She had known more than anyone, not just what Lionel had planned to reveal, but what he might never reveal if gently persuaded otherwise. She had been present when Peter was brought to the parish. She had handled the birth records. She had managed the accounts. She had known about Eleanor Blaine. And the final draft letter she'd tried to destroy. It was not the first she had intercepted. Perhaps she had even forged earlier ones herself. Miss Marple returned to the infirmary under the pretense of delivering flowers. Mrs. Copley sat by the window, thinner now, her eyes watchful. Miss Marple placed the blooms on the table, then said softly, "You knew he had written to Edward. You tried to retrieve it before anyone else could read it. Mrs. Copley didn't speak. He trusted you with the finances, with the records, but you feared what he would do if Peter took control. Not because of Peter's character, but because of what Peter's access would expose. The land grants, the inheritance tax errors, the payments made to the orphanage under your name. Quiet things, unrecorded." Mrs. Copley blinked slowly. "You let Hilda take the blame, because you knew her well enough to know she would carry it, that she'd rather be seen as the jealous niece than admit she was misled." At last, Mrs. Copley spoke, her voice no louder than paper sliding across a desk. He was going to undo it all. Years of keeping things balanced, of making sure no one saw how close we'd come to losing the parish. He was going to give it away, and for what, a boy he barely knew? Miss Marple's voice was soft. A boy he had denied for too long. "I wasn't cruel," Mrs. Copley whispered. "I never wanted anyone hurt." "But someone was," Miss Marple replied. "And you let another bear the weight of it." She left the infirmary in silence, the truth no longer a mystery, only a sorrow. Mrs. Copley would never stand trial. Her health was too fragile. But in her final days she would know that someone had seen through the last mask. Miss Marple returned to the vicarage as the sun dipped behind the hedges, casting long golden rays across the grass. Peter met her at the gate. "Is it over?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "Yes, the truth at last, all of it." He didn't ask for details. He didn't need to. Inside, the bells of St. Luke's rang once, clear and untroubled for the first time since that midnight toll. And this time they rang not for death, nor warning, but for clarity. A signal that the story, long tangled in silence and shadows, had finally been told to its end. The truth, once fully unraveled, did not ring with triumph, but settled over Milchester like dusk over the downs. Quiet, steady, irreversible. There were no courtrooms, no press, no grand confessions beneath blazing lights. But the truth, carried in the measured words of Miss Marple and the weary acknowledgments of Inspector Craddock, made its way through the channels that mattered. It was passed hand to hand, not like gossip, but like something heavier, like responsibility. Mrs. Copley remained under care, officially listed as unfit for prosecution, though her silence now spoke louder than any courtroom testimony. Her health waned steadily, and she gave no further statements, not even to Craddock, who visited once more with a notepad in hand and left without a word written. Hilda, for her part, accepted the consequences laid before her, not incarceration, but disinheritance, removal from the trust, and quiet exile from the only village she had ever belonged to. She neither protested nor apologized. Her presence faded like smoke, leaving behind no fire, only the lingering scent of what had almost consumed everything. But it was Peter whose life changed most. With the final documents confirmed, the estate and land now legally his, he found himself walking halls that had once felt borrowed, rooms that had whispered someone else's name. He did not celebrate, he did not redecorate. He kept the vicarage much as it had always been, simple, measured, still. And Miss Marple, watching him from her place at the garden table one late afternoon, understood that he had inherited more than property. He had inherited restraint. As they sipped their tea, he looked up from a letter he had been reading. "They've confirmed it," he said. "The bishop's office, the telegram, the old letters, even the payments Mrs. Copley arranged. They matched it all. It's over. Now," Miss Marple stirred her tea, "truth rarely ends anything, Peter. It simply changes what comes next." He studied her. "How did you know that it was Mrs. Copley, not Hilda, who was truly behind it?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "It was never any one clue, but the moment the letters vanished, I asked myself who knew they existed. Only me, only those I told. But the fact that they were removed so precisely, so swiftly, it had to be someone who didn't panic when they heard of them, someone who had long known exactly where they were." Peter nodded. "But she seemed so loyal." "Loyalty, when twisted by fear, can become the most dangerous force of all," Miss Marple said. She wasn't malicious, but she was terrified, of change, of exposure, of what she'd protected for decades crumbling under the weight of a name she didn't trust. You weren't Peter to her, you were disruption. And Hilda, she was order. Predictable, containable. Peter set the letter down. So she let it all unfold, let Hilda take the fall, even let someone else's hands do the harm. She never intended for Lionel to die, Miss Marple said. But when he fell, she saw her moment. And when Hilda saw him, she chose not to stop it either. Each played their part, knowingly or not. And I simply followed the ripples. Peter looked down. It's strange. I always wanted to know who I was. I thought it would bring peace. But all it's done is show me how fragile everything really is. Miss Marple smiled gently. Identity is not built from names or blood. It's built from what we do with the truth once we hold it. He folded the letter away. So what now? You live, she said. Quietly, if you like, but honestly, that's more than most inherit. That evening, as Miss Marple packed her things to return home to St. Mary Mead, Inspector Craddock joined her at the station bench with a flask of tea and a sheaf of papers tucked under one arm. They're closing the file officially next week, he said. Not as a murder, accidental death, circumstantial concealment. And justice? She asked. He shrugged. Sometimes justice is just the absence of further harm. She nodded. And sometimes it's knowing the truth, even if it arrives too late. He handed her a folder. Inside were photographs from the early investigation, scenes from the vestry, the church gate, the letter fragments. You missed nothing, he said. Not one step. Oh, I missed plenty, Miss Marple replied, eyes on the passing clouds. But I listened. That's how most people miss the truth. They stop listening when the story begins to fit. Craddock stood. Well, I'm listening now. If there's anything else. There's always something else, she said. But this time, I think, the silence will hold. As the train approached, with its soft metallic hum trailing into the countryside, Miss Marple rose and looked back one last time toward the church spire rising beyond the hedges. The bell was silent, the windows calm, but somewhere behind it all, the secrets, the silences, the sins forgiven and not, she saw what remained. Not villains or victims, but people, fallible, fearful, and always somewhere, hiding from themselves. The train doors opened. She stepped aboard, and as the platform emptied and Milchester receded behind her, she left behind not just a solved case, but a story gently set back on its rightful shelf, one that might never be told aloud, but would never again be misunderstood. The train rolled through the countryside, its rhythm steady and soothing, as Miss Marple sat by the window, her handbag nestled against her side and her gloves resting lightly on her lap. The quiet hum of conversation drifted from another compartment, but she barely registered it. Her mind was still fixed on Milchester, the bell tower, the vestry, the faces now consigned to memory. In most stories, this would be the end. The truth uncovered, justice weighed, balance restored. But Miss Marple knew better than to trust tidy endings. She had seen too many final acts rewritten in silence. Closure was rarely complete. She reached into her handbag and removed the vellum letter she'd kept from the drawer in Lionel's study, the one addressed to Edward, the church treasurer, warning him not to trust her. It was the Reverend's last attempt at insurance, and Miss Marple had intended to return it to Craddock. But something about it still unsettled her, not in its content, but in its voice. Lionel Greaves had always been precise, even reverent, in tone. But this letter was clipped, urgent, almost fearful. That alone hadn't disturbed her. What did was the salutation. "If you're reading this, it means I've failed to stop it." The phrase had caught her attention first. It suggested the Reverend had been preparing for a confrontation, not just discovery, but danger. And yet he had spoken to no one of threats, no indication of unease beyond what Miss Marple had gleaned from his notes. So why the secrecy? Why the veil of indirect warnings? She turned the letter over again and noticed what she'd missed before, a faint imprint on the back, as if another note had once lain on top when he'd written it, and the pen had pressed through. She tilted it toward the window light. There were marks, slight but visible. She took a pencil from her bag and gently shaded the back of the vellum. A few faint words appeared, staggered across the page. Not Peter. Never was Peter. The real... She stared. The sentence was broken, incomplete, but its meaning was clear enough to strike something deep and cold within her. Not Peter. She folded the paper slowly, carefully, and sat back in her seat. The wheels of the train clicked rhythmically beneath her. All this time, the story had been understood one way. Peter was the child Eleanor Blaine had left behind, the one Lionel and his father had taken in, hidden, and then tried to erase. But this faint message, likely from a second letter or perhaps even a page the Reverend had discarded, suggested otherwise. Had they been wrong? She thought of the timeline, of the telegram, of the altered certificate. Every piece of evidence pointed toward concealment, but the source of it, the identity itself, had never been confirmed through anything but circumstantial notes. Had Peter truly been Eleanor's son? Or had he been someone else entirely, inserted into the cover-up to replace a different child, someone who had vanished? The thought came not as panic, but as a murmur, a ripple in still water. If not Peter, then who? She let the question linger as the train pulled into St. Mary Mead. The porter helped her down with a polite nod, and she walked the familiar road, home, nodding to neighbours, receiving a warm smile from the grocer's wife. The village was quiet, just as she'd left it. But her thoughts remained behind, among the brambles of Milchester's tangled truths. That evening, seated in her parlour with her teacup and her knitting resting untouched beside her, she opened her notebook, and wrote a single line at the top of a fresh page. Identity accepted is not always identity true. It was not that she suspected Peter of wrongdoing. No. He had been honest, open, painfully so, but it was the story around him that now felt unfinished. If the Reverend's final message had been a correction, not Peter, then something, somewhere, remained deliberately wrong. She thought of Mrs. Copley, how easily she'd managed the records, how she'd taken control of Peter's introduction to the parish. Had the lie been about who he was, or who someone else had once been? A soft knock came at the door. She opened it to find a telegram boy, rain-speckled and apologetic. "Message from Milchester, miss, sent urgent." She signed, tipped him, and closed the door before unfolding the envelope. Received Lockley's ledgers, one entry curious. Name, S. Greaves. No record in local registry. Stop. Connects to 1946. Parish grant under blank trust. Investigating. Craddock. Miss Marple stood still for a moment, the paper trembling faintly between her fingers. S. Greaves, not Peter. Someone else. Someone hidden in plain sight. She crossed the room and lit the lamp, her teacup forgotten. Another name. Another thread. The pattern wasn't finished. It had simply paused. And now it was beginning again. A different child, a second heir, or a ghost buried under the name of someone else. She sat, opened her notebook again, and turned to a clean page beneath the first line. There, with her pencil sharpened and her thoughts sharper still, she wrote 3 words. Who was Sarah? The wind picked up outside. In the quiet, Miss Marple smiled, warm, wise, and a touch sad. The dead did not always stay silent, and in villages, like Milchester, where names and sins wove tightly together, truth had a habit of whispering back. The mystery, she knew now, had never truly ended. It had simply taken a breath.